Today we will finish the Progressive Era by looking at the state of labor in the United States. We will consider the major labor unions and key strikes in the lead-up to the Progressive Era. We'll also consider the changes to American politics, with more power to the people and less power to the corrupt political machines that epitomized American politics during the Gilded Age. And in the end, we just might offer the ladies the right to vote. The issues that unions fought for in the late 19th century were addressed by the progressives in the 20th century. And there was success with regards to the length of the workday, improving work conditions, and on child labor. On child labor, progressives showed the detrimental effects of factory work on children. They were more accident-prone, and it impacted their physical development and ultimately lowered wages for everyone. Progressives got the Congress to pass the Keating-Owen Act in 1916, which said that goods produced by children under the age of 14 could not be shipped across state lines. If you're running a business in 1916, obviously you want to be able to sell your goods outside of your state. And while the Supreme Court ruled that this law was unconstitutional in the Hammer versus Dagenhart case in 1918, most states would pass child labor laws during this time. The 8-hour workday had always been a goal of labor unions, and the progressives picked up this cause in the 20th century. And the Supreme Court upheld a 10-hour workday law for women in Muller versus Oregon in 1908, and in 1917, in Bunting versus Oregon, upheld a similar law for men. Progressives also fought for and won workers' compensation. Workers' comp allows workers who are injured as part of their job to be paid while they are out. The progressives led the way to improve working conditions in the early 20th century. Let's go back to before Theodore Roosevelt became president in 1901. The politics of the Gilded Age was not a golden age for American politics. This period was marked by ineffective and corrupt local and state governments and a federal government that did next to nothing. No president during this time period served 2 consecutive terms. I have a master's degree in U.S. history and cannot tell you very much about these presidents. Rutherford B. Hayes became president through the Compromise of 1877 and was referred to as his fraudulency by his critics because of the nature of his election. James A. Garfield is best known for his assassination by Charles Guiteau on July 2, 1881, the second U.S. president to be assassinated. Chester A. Arthur then was elevated to the presidency and was president when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. Grover Cleveland is best known as the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. We will see Grover again in a second. Benjamin Harrison won the presidency by receiving fewer votes than his opponent, and there is Grover again. Cleveland would be followed by McKinley, whose assassination led to Theodore Roosevelt and the start of the Progressive Era. During the Gilded Age, political bosses ran the political party for a given city. Tightly organized, corrupt groups known as political machines epitomized local politics during the Gilded Age. These machines controlled access to jobs, built business licenses, and local courts. They offered services and favors to voters for their political support. Election fraud was common during this time period. The machines targeted immigrants. As immigrants came over, they needed jobs and places to live. The bosses would take care of you as long as you voted for them. Boss Tweed was the prime example of this during the Gilded Age. As head of Tammany Hall, New York City's Democratic political machine, it was estimated that 65% of public funds for New York City went to Tweed and his supporters. An example of how these funds were used, the New York City courthouse that was built cost $3 million to build, but the city was charged $13 million. That $10 million went to Boss Tweed. These machines were characterized by corruption and showed what politics was like in the Gilded Age and what progressives would respond to. Progressives wanted to make local government more responsive to the people and not bosses and political machines. To do this, they initiated 2 new forms of city government. The city commission government was a system where 5 commissioners were elected, each with an area of expertise, and each oversaw a department. Collectively, the 5 would enact legislation. Now there would be people elected who knew what they were doing, and they were not people who were just elected because who they were friends with. The city council system is where people elect city councils, and the council will then hire a manager who administers the government and appoints other people. And we would see these types of governments pop up across cities across the country. At the state level, progressives brought about reforms that gave much more power to the people. The initiative gives the people power to propose laws. Normally a certain number of signatures are required. Recently, we have seen ballot initiatives regarding gay marriage and legalization of marijuana in many states, some successful, some not. The initiative gives the people a much bigger say in their government. The referendum gives the people power to vote on laws that they might not find effective. If they don't like the law, they can vote on it. If the referendum is successful, the law will go away. The recall gives voters the right to remove a public official from office. This was how the Terminator, aka Arnold Schwarzenegger, became governor of California in 2003. The secret ballot made it so that your vote is your business. Now bosses could not force people to vote their way. Direct primaries allowed people to select candidates for each party, not political machines and bosses. Before the Progressive Era, U.S. senators had been chosen not by the people, but by a majority vote in the state legislature. Progressives believed that this led to U.S. senators being out of touch with their constituents. But by 1912, a total of 30 states had adopted the progressive idea of the direct election of senators, and by 1913, the 17th Amendment was added to the Constitution. The 17th Amendment says that senators in the United States will be elected directly by the people, not state legislatures. Regarding big business, there were two major laws passed. The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed before the Progressive Era in 1890. It gave the government limited power to break up trusts and monopolies. The Supreme Court aided business by helping to stop many of the attempts by the government to use the law, and eventually the government stopped trying to enforce it because of these roadblocks. In 1914, a much tougher law was passed. The Clayton Antitrust Act gave more power to the government in going after monopolies and trusts. The government could now punish businesses that restricted competition and fixed prices. It also said that court injunctions could not be used to stop strikes, a victory for labor even if it was 20 years after the Pullman strike. And this finally brings us to women's suffrage. In American history, first you had to own land or be a member of a church, be white, and be male in order to vote. Through Jacksonian democracy in the early 19th century, we saw all white males voting. During Reconstruction, even more people could vote after the passage of the 15th Amendment. Then all males could vote. Now, the only restriction left to voting was gender. In some Western territories, women could vote for local issues. In the Wyoming Territory, women had the right to vote as early as 1869. In the 20th century, women were becoming more visible in American society. They represented a growing percentage of the workforce and wanted to have a say in their government. This movement for women's suffrage would be the largest reform movement of the Progressive Era. And this movement benefited from strong leaders. Elizabeth Cady Stanton at Seneca Falls and Susan B. Anthony started the movement, and by the 20th century it passed to Carrie Chapman Catt, who argued that empowering women to vote would allow for them to take better care of the families they were raising, and Alice Paul. Paul was more militant. She organized protests and was arrested and sent to prison in Occoquan. She went on a hunger strike and brought added attention to the issue and increased pressure on President Wilson to do something about women's suffrage. Ultimately, it would be women's support for World War I, the way they helped sell the war through the war bond drives, and how they took on roles in factories that had been previously held by men, that would lead to passage of the 19th Amendment. It was the 19th Amendment in 1920, 132 years after the Constitution was ratified, that women finally had a say in their government. After ratification, Carrie Chapman Catt organized the League of Women Voters, which was dedicated to keeping women informed about candidates and issues. The men now had to pay attention to the women. Let's close the show by looking at the end of the Progressive Era. There were many successes to talk about during the Progressive Era. More efficient local governments, more power to the people at the state level. We had presidents who actually were active and did something. Women were voting. The workday was shorter. The government was actually going after some of the big business. There were national forests. And this is just to name a few. But the race relations at the time was still a major issue. Woodrow Wilson was not for civil rights. He was viewed by some as a racist. He put many Southerners in prominent positions, which led to an expansion of segregation. The government during the time opposed federal anti-lynching laws, calling it a state issue. This is a common cop-out for politicians when they want to avoid tough topics. And remember, though, they needed Southern votes to get elected, also to pass some of the progressive legislation that they viewed as important. Jim Crow would rule the South virtually uncontested until the start of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s. Ultimately, it would be World War I that would bring the Progressive Era to an end. Americans became more interested in what was going on overseas than what was happening at home. As one era ended, another was beginning. We will look at American imperialism next time. Until then, good night, Albuquerque.